Good day, everybody, and welcome to another iteration of Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelier, along with my co-host Jimmy Tran, who also produces the show. We're going to begin to market the show a little bit more aggressively in the coming weeks. Forgive my casual, prosaic appearance today, but I just finished working out and I didn't have time to, change. So please forgive me. I don't like to be non-presentable. At any rate, today we're going to talk about, are we living under a monarchy, not just Trump, but the apparatus that we call a constitutional republic? Are we living under a monarchy? Is Trump and the sleepy guy before him, the embarrassment called Biden, was he a king as well? And so on and so forth. So I think, Jimmy, you're going to argue that we're living under a monarchy, and I absolutely don't think we are. Again, tell your friends and associates about our show. We talk about obvious things, and we try to engage in critical thinking, conviction, but we're also fluid enough that we can change our mind and our position,
Yeah.
which most of these dumbbells that have shows don't do. That's why I can't stand, and I'm saying it out loud, Hannity and Laura Ingraham and some of these guys. And I'm more of a conservative than a liberal, but at any rate, these people are just too monolithic. They're not fluid. They're not willing to change their mind about anything, right? And as we know, Jimmy, we're living in a universe that by definition is in a continual state of flux.
Yeah. Well, everything is, right? I mean, change is the one constant that we can all, experience, as they say. And yeah, no, I'm glad to be here. This is actually a really interesting topic, because right now, of course, we know that there's this protest, no kings. And so what does that really mean? And so I thought it'd be fun to actually have this kind of conversation because I think it'd be worth discussion. And I've really thought long and hard in various ways, and I think that I can build a case that we actually, the construct of our government is more of a monarchy type than what we consider. So I'll build that case, and hopefully,
And I'll obliterate it brick by brick.
All
As
right, all
this
right.
is not a monarchy.
Well,
It might it might be in theory patterned after a monarchy to some regards. And I'm going to talk about the Roman Republic
yeah,
because that's really what
absolutely,
it's
yeah,
built around.
absolutely, and that's part of what makes this kind of interesting topic because I think that we, because we're saying, okay, this is a democracy, right? That's the, and and yes, that's correct, but it's also a monarchy, and this is what I try to explain, right, to people about that. And so it's not. So what we have is actually not a singular type, which is why it's been so difficult at times to try to explain to people, right? And so and then so people use different terms, and so it gets all convoluted and created, because we actually have, in any best guess, in my estimation, we actually have three forms of government, all kind of melded into one as our form of government. If you look at the way that our Constitution delegate, if you will, the powers, right? I mean, it's a separation of power. So a totalitarianism, a monarchy, a dictatorship, right? What is that? That is where all the power is concentrated under one individual, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose and point. And if you look at the way that our government is structured,
Kind of. You
it
got to
is.
remember, even under certain kingdoms, and even under autocratic and totalitarian, uh, I guess you'd say, frames of governance, you still had the Politburo, you still
Yeah,
had under King Henry, you still had earls, and you still had queens.
correct.
So that's not entirely true that the concentration of power is one person, even under possibly the most apoth- the apotheosis of evil and concentration of power, Hitler. Even he had Goebbels, and he
Yeah,
had
yeah,
propaganda
sure.
ministers. So there were other delegations of power, even under those extreme concentrations of autocracy.
Rick, but you made a very important statement there. Delegated. Okay. So, which is important because, I mean, if we take let's say the beloved, Roman Empire, right? You've got the Republic and then you've got the imperial period, right?
Yeah,
And
two very different forms
very
of
different
government.
form of government.
Extremely.
Exactly.
And
But-
most people conflate the two.
Yeah.
They think that, well, I don't have them here. Gaius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Trajan,
Yeah.
Diocletian,
Nero.
Constantine.
Yeah.
Those were emperors. They were not republic counselors.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later because the consulship formed as the executive branch under the republic.
Yeah.
They were not operating as a council.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we can break some of that down. And so, I mean, I just kind of did an interesting kind of cursory break. So I asked, okay, ChatGPT, right? I mean, we know AI, right? And so I was like, okay, give me...
I don't know what you're talking about.
You know about ChatGPT, right? The AI? No. Okay, no. So...
Everything I do organically. I write. I take notes.
Yeah.
I read the paper.
But you got to be aware of what's out there. I mean, even if you don't use it.
Don't make assumptions because I don't know, and I don't use chat. I wrote a novel. Every word, every letter is mine. I'm proud of that. So we're organic.
Yeah.
I didn't have some robot, whatever the hell it's called, narrating.
Okay, I'll make. I mean,
again, this is inside reality.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about, are we living under a monarchy, which I don't think we are.
I don't think that's necessarily the construct or the position. I'm not saying that we are in a monarchy, but I think that we do have kind of a monarchy kind of construct that is in play and is how our government is structured intentionally that way.
That's what you just said, something that changes the conversation, because I thought before the show we were going to talk about, are we living under a monarchy? And I thought you were taking the position we are, because I agree there are elements of a monarchy that we are living under when you're talking about the architecture of a constitutional republic.
Yeah, correct. And that's what I'm trying to point out, is that we do have a monarchy in the sense that, okay, so let's break it down for a moment, right? And so we have 3 branches of government, right? Outlined by the Constitution, right? And we've got the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, okay? And each branch of government, of course, has their respective power because it's separated out. So that, and this is where I think part of the problem is that people have failed to understand that these are equal branches of government, meaning that the one branch is equal to the other branches. So that means that they can challenge and override, and that's why we have those mechanisms.
I never heard that. They're separate. I never thought they were equal in terms of power. I never thought that.
They are, but they are. That's the point, right?
They're separate. They're not.
They're separate, but they're.
Where in the Constitution does it discuss the balances of power that each of these autonomous constructs occupy? Executive, judicial, and legislative.
Well, good question.
Yeah, that's why it's called inside reality, because we don't make assumptions here. We try to dissect everything. That's why I think this show is distinctive, and that's why we hope that you viewers share this show with other people, because we don't use stupid platitudes like, oh, Trump's a king, or whatever the hell. It's like, okay, make your argument, and let's dissect the architecture of that construct. Right, Jimmy?
Yeah.
We dissect architectures, constructs, ideas. We dissect them. So right now you're looking up where in the Constitution.
I'm looking up the specific
the balance of power within each of those 3 separate entities called the executive, legislative, and judicial.
Yeah. So when you, so in the world where this was developed, right, we got a king called King Henry VIII, I think it was, that was in power at the time when this was being formulated, right?
It was King George. What are you talking about?
Oh wait, sorry. Yeah, right, King George.
Golly.
King.
Yeah, King Henry was like
Sorry,
1500s.
yeah, no, my
King
brain.
George was
Okay, okay, yeah, you're right,
1780
King
to
George.
like 1780.
Yeah, Elizabeth's father. Anyway,
No. King Henry was part of the tutorship, I
yeah,
think
yeah,
it
no,
was.
I remember, yeah, with Thomas, Saint Thomas,
Thomas
and
Cromwell
yeah,
and
and all that, yeah, and all that,
Elizabeth,
Animal Inn,
the
and
White
all that, yeah,
Queen,
yeah, yeah.
the
Okay.
daughter of Anne Boleyn and King. I thought you knew your history, big fella. Come on.
I do, but sometimes my brain kind of lose track of time here. Okay, so basically defined, it says here, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. That's what it says in Article 1, Section 1.
Legislative branch.
The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States, Article 2, Section 1. The
Okay.
judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, Article 3, Section 1. So that's where the principle of co-equal branches of government.
You got to be careful how you use the word
derived.
power, though, because power with regard to the judicial branch, what is a judge's job in a jury, and what is the jury's job, and what is the judge's job in that framework? Do you know?
Say that again.
What is the jury's job in a court operational experience, and what is the judge's job?
So
You know?
so the jury's job is to deliberate on
To determine
yeah.
truth. What's
Well,
the judge's job?
To enact,
To
make
determine law. To
Okay.
determine law.
All right.
So the judge orchestrates law within the framework of a courtroom.
Yeah.
The people who are on the jury representing us, like Congress, they're supposed to interpret truth.
Correct.
So
All right.
how does this relate to, how is this germane to your point about the three branches of government? The judicial branch is supposed to interpret. It's supposed to be an interpretive body.
Correct.
It's not supposed to orchestrate power.
Correct.
It is. So I think you used the power rather liberally when you talked about the judicial branch. It's not supposed to have intrinsic power. It's supposed to be endowed with the capacity to interpret law.
Well, that is the power. Well, the power that it has is to interpret the Constitution and to determine constitutionality, basically, right? I mean,
So you're using the construct of being interpretive with power. You think those
well,
are,
no.
those
Well,
are
that's
interchangeable?
well, this is what I'm trying to point out, is that these separations of power is the function that generally in the history of governance was relegated to the one individual, the king, in the case of the monarchy. Okay, right? So meaning that the king makes the rule, it makes the determination whether you're guilty or not, and then he enacts judgment. Yeah, just like in the story of, we talked a little bit religious and stuff. In the story of like I think in Queen Esther, right? There was a story where the king had already set out a command to allow for the destruction of the Jewish, people, and so he said, I can't change that because I've already enacted that. Right now, I can then make a new law that says that you can protect yourself and defend yourself and fight back and so forth. And so that's the only way that was the only option he was given within the constraint of, and you can make the case that that makes him not ultra powerful, right, or complete power, which is fine,
Come back
But
to
the
our
point,
topic again. You're listening to Inside, or you're watching Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelier. This is Jimmy Tran. Today we're talking about: are we living under a monarchy? Is the president, whoever occupies that office, a king? I say no.
Do we have a king or no king, right? And so that's part of the question, right?
Yeah.
So
I say no. I say no.
And all right, so you're on the no kings list. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm going to get to my case here in a minute, but there's a million. There's at least 50 other stopgaps between him exercising autocratic singular power construct and not, and that's the governors of states.
Well, no,
Then you
that's the
got
point. Yeah,
Congress,
correct.
and you
And then you
know,
got all the way down. I mean,
then you
that's where.
then you go to Senate, which ultimately has to approbate what Congress puts forth as legislation.
Yeah.
So the king,
So
by definition, under your auspices, could initiate a law
no, no, that's not what I'm saying.
and
Okay, let me.
and or I guess at his behest, because usually kings were men,
Yeah.
uh, and then it became the law of the land as put forth by the earls and the
Yeah,
local
this he
lords.
has a signet ring, and then
You're under
everything,
the
and then yeah.
feudalistic framework, which is a whole different
So so
apparatus
th-
of governance.
so you have to follow my thought
Okay.
process and logic here for a moment, okay? So we have this construct called the monarchy of the king, right? Okay, but the concentration of power into one individual is where the problem lies, and which is what my again reading of the various parts of the forming and framing of constitution and the government. Our founding fathers has, I know I give more liberal thinking to them, in terms of favor. I know you don't like the idea that they're such brilliant people, but anyway, that's a whole different.
I think they're not overrated. I think they're hyper exaggerated as brilliant.
Perhaps,
I think they
but
were,
certainly there's some wisdom in it
yeah,
because in the process
obvious.
of form
Yeah.
in the process of forming this constitution and this republic, they evaluated all the different forms and try to figure out the best way to do this, and this is what I feel like that what we've been given, right?
Yeah, they
So that's
commandeered other people's work.
yeah,
So
absolutely. Well,
it's
that's
not
what.
like they invented the Constitution and
No, of course
separation
not.
of power.
Yeah,
The
we had the
Roman
Magna
Republic,
Carta, 16, whatever it was.
that was not 16, that was 12, 15 or something like
Okay,
that. You guys
whatever.
gotta
I'm
get
not
your
good with
history
dates
right.
anyway. So, but my point is that you have these documents and the history. You've got all of this stuff, and you even had, like, I think it was the Six Nation Native American nation that was in that area, the Issaquah Federation or whatever. Don't sorry, I butchered the name, but there's all this part of the history of the formation of this, and so all this stuff is borrowed. We know about the Roman Empire. Of course, if we don't learn from our history,
Not Roman
right,
Empire, Roman Republic.
and then the
They
Roman
borrowed
Republic
from the Roman Republic.
and the Roman Empire. Again, my point is that
Not so
they
much
look.
the empire, no, because the Republic you had two councils
Yes,
that operated for 1 year. You had the Optimites and you had the Populari, the Democrats and the
sure,
Republicans.
sure.
They actually had two
The
parties
two-party system. Yeah, I get
for the
that.
most part, for the most part.
Yeah,
And they would elect the assembly operated as the democracy part.
democracy part.
You
Yeah,
have to have 97 votes from different groups of assemblies, and the tribune acted between the Senate, the council, and the assembly. So back in the Roman Empire, which operated from 500 BC to about 40 BC until my friend's not there, not Hitler, Julius Gaius Caesar was assassinated,
yeah,
the first permanent dictator, and then Augustus, about 30 years later, formed the empire. But anyway, under the Republic, you had the executive branch, the two councils. One was supposed to represent the Republican parties, which was essentially
yeah,
the Optimites,
yeah.
and then you had the Democrats, which kind of were just regular folk, and that was the other council. They were the Populari. Okay, that was supposed to serve as the executive branch, and then the Senate, old wisdom. I think that's kind of what it meant. You had about 500 senators, by the way, under the old Roman Republic, and that was the aristocracy. They were the landowners, a little bit more formally educated. And then you had the assembly, which was made up of various groups of just the Roman people themselves, right?
Yeah.
That operated as the democracy. By the way, did you know that the councilors, the two councils, and the Senate under the Roman Empire, Roman Republic rather, Roman Republic, could not initiate law? Only the assembly
Yes,
could do
and
that.
that's the case here too. This is the point that I'm trying to make, is that the separation of powers strips this monarchy, if you will, from these. Because here's the thing, you just also proved my case too, because you had a council that serves as the executive branch.
Two,
Okay.
two men.
Yes, but
They were
the point,
council.
but No, the full council. Yeah, that's fine. But in the Constitution, we only have a president. One. So
But he cannot initiate law.
I understand that,
So
but
he's
that's
not a
not the
king.
power. But that's not the power that was delegated to him through the Constitution. The lawmaking portion of the powers of a monarchy is stripped away from that individual.
So we're not living under a
Hey.
kingdom. Thank you very much. We'll see you next
No,
week on Insider.
no, not that simple. Not that simple. You know, this is the part that, again, when you look at the analysis and the brilliance of this system and the model, which is really interesting because all the other quote-unquote democracies of the world don't follow this model, which is part of why I think we have some of the problems we have. You know, I mean, the Politburo and all that kind of stuff is part of the problem because
Parliament.
because when you have the that you can manipulate you can make the case that the manipulation is higher when you have all these different individuals to try to do this or that, and this is where the part of what I can't remember exactly who said it. Okay, so if you know from our audience, please drop it in the comment. I'd love to remember exactly who said it, but the principle was that when in the time of war, which where the basis of this distinction was, that you cannot have a committee. You had to have somebody that can command and control, and that's really what was the driving element behind the executive branch and the concentration of powers, if you will, of the executive powers. Not all of power, but just the executive power was concentrated into one, which is why even the cabinets are really more of a board of advisor type of, rather than a board of directors, which is what you usually have in a company, right? I mean, in a company you have
So you're
a
saying the
CEO
designation of commander-in-chief, it's very simple. The reason you have to have one person making decisions is because in war, things can happen pretty quickly.
Well, exactly. That's
And
the
if
principle.
somebody's going to launch nuclear bombs at you,
You need to have somebody make that
to
call
make a decision in seconds.
at that moment.
Minutes,
Yeah.
in seconds,
Now,
because,
of course,
you're risking complete obliteration.
correct.
That's the commander-in-chief designation.
Correct. That's why this is the position of the president, is the presiding officer or presiding executive. Okay. In the case of like a board of directors.
I think you're sort of saying, again, this is inside reality. Share this, like it, do whatever the hell you want with it. But we don't just, we dissect narratives, topics. Like we're talking about, everybody throws around the word king. Everybody throws around Trump's a king and all that nonsense. We're dissecting what a king is and how that operates. Correct. So what I'm hearing you say, and I'll agree with this part, is under the duress, extreme duress of a war, particularly like October 1962, when you had the threat of nuclear holocaust throughout the obliteration of planet Earth.
Yeah.
President Kennedy at that time, John F. Kennedy, served as a commander-in-chief. He was king for a week because he had the singular power to make a decision about launching nuclear counteroffensive or whatever it was. Yeah. So I would argue you're right.
It's not just a week.
Under those limited conditions, under the threat of nuclear warfare, somebody like Trump or Truman,
or even Biden in the case before,
not a sentient being.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying that the person in that position, in that position,
but
they are vested that power.
A set of circumstances that are unique, called the threat of nuclear obliteration.
Annihilation, yeah.
So I would argue you're right. The president, the executive branch, and president of the United States occasionally does serve for ephemeral periods of time as a king, as commander-in-chief under that auspices. But other than that, under those unique conditions, he's not a king as part of the intrinsic power structure of that office.
Again, within that branch, he or she, whoever that is because they are the dictator of policies, dictator. Now, I'm not saying that everything that. Hold on.
For a limited time frame.
Yes, it is for a limited time frame, but that individual within that branch. If you had no other branch,
I conceded that point under those unique conditions. So you're trying to argue that position is serving as king throughout the
Well, no,
4 or 8 year period, that
well,
person's
the whole term of
away.
office, yes, it is. Remember the legislative branch deliberates, and if you've ever done any project, okay, with a group of people, trying to get anything done through committees is awful,
Yeah,
right?
because
We all know that.
camel is a
That's
horse that's designed by a committee.
yeah,
That's the old expression, because it's, they always just become a bureaucracy and incompetent. Anyway,
and that's part of the problem. And so when you have an executive branch that operates that way, you also have a problem, which is again why you have to have that separation of power, in my mind, right? Because again, like I said, all of the legislative, the lawmaking powers is stripped away from the executive branch for a reason. Just like all the powers to strip away the interpretation of what those laws means, is stripped away from that person as well, is why that's the separation of powers. To me, functionally, the Constitution, the whole of is the monarchy, if you will, rather than the individual. So that's kind of my kind of
today we're
thesis.
talking about, are we living under a monarchy? I say
Yeah.
no. Here's another reason why we're not. I keep wiping out your argument.
We're not a democracy either.
I never said that.
Okay, but I'm just saying, I'm pointing that out too.
I never.
It's clear. I'm not
There
saying
was
that you
never-
did.
There was never any intention to be a democracy, because look what's happened in LA
Yes,
when you have
agree.
mob
Mob
mentality.
rules. Exactly. That's the only reason.
And anyway, getting back to why we're not operating under a monarchy, the president signs what's called an executive
order. Yeah.
That's only in play while that person is occupying the office, or
Correct.
rescinds the executive order. Number
Correct.
two, under a monarchy, you have what are called usually family legacy
Yeah.
relationships that
That's
continue
another thing that's stripped away. Yeah.
the power of that office, or
Yep.
that like I think King Henry, as an example, in the 1500s, I think he was a tutor when he died. His because he never had a son that lived. I think he had several that lived for a short period of time. But his second wife, after Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, who he had beheaded under his auspices as a king, right, had Elizabeth, right?
Yeah.
That was the daughter
Yeah.
of Anne Boleyn, and
Yeah.
he became queen for about 50 years. So the almost in perpetuity, King Henry's tutorship, his kingdom, lasted for almost 80, 100 years.
Yeah.
Whether you like Trump or hate Trump, Trump cannot bequeath to his family ownership of that office for the next 80 years. That's another reason why we're not a kingdom. And he's not a king.
Again, that's another power, if you will, or another function that is stripped away so that can happen. I mean, that's why we have the federal law on nepotism, for instance. I think
You keep arguing the same point that I'm operating from, is we're not a kingdom. You keep using, we're stripping away stripping away these layers of what a king used to be or still is.
but that is still, to me, I think that my point is that is still the model. It's just that those powers and privileges and so forth were removed for various reasons. Okay, again, because the understanding of the founding fathers was basically that concentration of power with the Lord Acton's axiom, right? Absolute power corrupts and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So
we're not technically a kingdom.
What's that?
Here's another reason why we're not. Trump's not a king, although it looks like he is. If he does couple with Israel and provide them the B-2 bomber and the bunker bomb technology, he could do that unilaterally.
Correct.
However, so it would appear, for all intents and purposes, that we're in a war with Iran.
Yeah.
But the declaration of war has to happen
with the
Congress.
Exactly.
So technically, war is not declared by the president; it's declared by the second branch of Congress.
Exactly. Again,
that's why he's not a king.
Again,
because Congress has to declare war. under
Yeah.
your auspices that he has ultimate power in a singular position, he can declare war. And
No, that's
well,
not what I'm saying. Okay.
that's what a king does.
Well, no. What I'm my point is kind of a fine line point. Okay. Basically, he's a king, or he's a king basically within the confine of the executive branch and within the confine of the constitutional construct. Okay, that's it. That's my point
Well,
in
then
terms
he's
of
a
why.
tiny
That's
king.
why. Well, it's fine. It
He's
is
not a
still
big king.
okay. It's a tiny king. Fine. Maybe a king with not even a lowercase k. Whatever. But my point is that
Most
that
people, when they operate under the stupid platitude, "Oh, Trump's a king," they're operating under the
the
big
wrong
K,
exactly,
and assuming because they're dumb as hell
because they don't
that he
understand the
right.
powers.
They don't understand the powers, the architecture of what a king actually looks like.
and
That's what we're
also
talking about today.
and also what the Constitution provided to that branch of government. See,
Right.
I think that part of why we're having this problem today with this issue and stuff is because we're so far from understanding what the Constitution does allow for the
Correct.
executive branch versus the judicial branch. I mean, because
Correct.
it's all
Half the
convoluted.
population doesn't know what the difference between the Senate
And
and Congress is.
Congress, yeah, and that,
Half
yeah,
the population doesn't know the rudiments of mathematics.
yeah,
Can't balance a damn checkbook. Go to Walmart. Look around. Don't get mad. But I keep arguing the problem with the chaos that and I would argue that per our previous show, that as chaotic as we think we are, we're actually living in a very, upper class, very sophisticated world experience versus the last, 50,000 years of Homo
yeah,
sapiens.
yeah. Agree.
The problem layeth with the average American who's just disinterested, not educated, and not willing to take the time to understand what a republic is, what a democracy is, what a monarchy is, what real fascism government is.
Yep.
They
And
keep
what
doing the world
dictatorship
fascist.
is.
So let's talk about that for a second, because that
Yeah.
sort of relates to this.
Sure, absolutely.
The word fascist comes from the actual implement that the emperors were carrying around in their hand, which was a series of like arrows and I believe a snake. And let's talk about what fascism is versus a monarchy. Today we're talking about, do we live under a monarchy? I argue no. You're sort of arguing my case. In any event, this is inside reality. So what is your definition of a fascistic form of government? Mussolini was a fascist. Hitler became a fascist.
Yeah.
So what does that look like?
So my understanding of fascism is essentially it's where the state controls, you know.
What else? Because under a totalitarian form of government, the state controls everything, even under certain communistic forms.
Yeah.
The difference is, do you know? And it's obvious as hell. Nobody talks about it.
Okay, please enlighten us, because
Well, I'll enlighten you. That's why I'm Jeffrey Candelier, and this is Inside Reality. Under a fascistic form of governance, it's nationalistic, meaning my people are superior to everyone else.
Sure.
So there's a sort of eugenic component to fascism. That's why it galls me to hell when people throw the word fascism around, because it does such a disservice to the 10 to 12 million people that were obliterated under Nazi Germany in places like Dachau and those other industries that were designed to obliterate millions of people.
Yeah.
So when you use the word fascism, or we have to be very cognizant of, it means not only a totalitarian form of government, but it means our nation is somehow superior to everyone else as well. And you got to be very careful about how we use that. That's another element or component as to what fascism is all about. it's nationalistic. The
Yeah.
Nazis were Nazi means national
So, yeah.
party.
Yeah.
Meaning our German people are
Well,
are endowed with special inherent biological, physiological, intellectual. That's how crazy they were, right? The
yeah.
not They thought they were superior,
Yeah.
so they were fascistic.
Yeah.
That's Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it does, but it also,
Why don't people talk about that part of it though?
it's
Sorry?
important. It's good. Now there is one other piece to that, and that is that historically speaking, countries, nations were formed ethnocentrically, driven by a group of people, and then you form, and then you become that. And that's where a lot of the conflicts and stuff occurs because, you get the Bloods and the Crips kind of a, scenario.
France,
You know,
Germany, France,
yeah,
England,
yeah, exactly.
Scotland, Ireland, all that.
Yep.
Yeah.
But and of course, in order for you to save your countries, and a lot of times you'll give your daughter, to marry the other guy's son.
Catherine of Aragon.
Correct. And so you end up with
Spain married England to
England
Catherine
and
of Aragon.
exactly. And so that's kind of how, back in the days, and that's how you managed and control and so forth. Now, of course,
Right.
in our modern day, we have a very different model. I mean, especially here in the United States, where literally, and this is where I go with my premise, why the framers of, our founding, fathers have done a good job of laying out the vision. I mean, I know that you don't agree with me in that all men are created equal, implying that
They didn't mean all men were created equal. They
well,
meant
again,
all
that's what
men
it
look
says.
like
Okay.
us.
Well, that's what it says. Okay.
Yeah, well-
Yes, you could try to. We can all try to read into it.
Or any
Whatever.
of the Native American people that they were surrounded by, were they considered equal to
Well,
Madison, Hamilton?
perhaps
No.
not it.
The
Well,
blacks, that many of them were slave owners. And again, I think Jefferson and those guys were incredible people.
well, there's one thing that we don't talk about too, that blacks that
They
owned
were not
slaves. I mean, there
We're
were
not
also black
considering
slaves.
all men being equal. And by the way, there were no women that were given the same powers as
Well-
Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison and
Well,
Washington.
hold on. We do because if you look at the evolution of the Constitution and the evolution of I mean, that's part of the vision coming into.
When they used the words all men are created equal in 1774, 75, 76, 78, 1787, when you
Yeah.
actually realized the Constitution, I don't believe the founders were using those words to mean all human Homo sapiens in their context.
Well, if okay,
No.
then why didn't
No.
why didn't they put the adjectives and the qualifiers in there to define it?
They had to, because blacks weren't a threat. The Native Americans weren't a threat anymore. Women certainly weren't a threat. They didn't have any resources. They didn't have to.
Okay, well,
arrogant.
whether intentionally or accidentally, this is what we've got. Okay,
Yeah, but
and certainly,
Those
oh no, hold on.
changes to what
Hold
they
on.
said didn't happen until 250 years later.
The what?
Many of those changes didn't happen until 225, 250 years later. Blacks
No,
didn't have
we're at
equal
200.
rights.
We're at 250 years, so it's more. It's
Whatever,
It's 100 years. It was 100 years. It's 100 years later.
1964 was almost 200 years after Jefferson wrote all men are created equal, when you
Yeah.
had the Equal Rights Amendment that legislation going on.
Well, no, but
So
you
almost
also
200 years, blacks didn't have equal rights until 1964. And today,
Again-
blacks still don't have complete equal rights, in my view, as far as how they're actual played out. Women didn't have the damn right to vote till 1920. That's
Yeah.
almost 150 years after your brilliant founders used those
Oh,
words,
my-
all men are created equal. Again,
Yeah.
amazing people. Some of them are on Mount Rushmore, but they were extremely clear in my mind about what they meant by all white aristocracy men like us are created equal.
Okay. I mean that's fine. So the text does allow you to interpret it that way, and it certainly allowed me to interpret the way I interpret it as well, because again, the definite qualifiers are not there in heart.
We've got only a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So anyway,
So just to be clear, you're saying with Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, George Washington wasn't really part of it,
No,
other than he was a general. But when these people framed the words "all men are created equal,"
these are
you're
all.
saying that they intended with it, this is 1776, 1787, somewhere in there. They intended those words to mean blacks that were slaves are equal, Native Americans who were sequestering and slaughtering and wiping out in Canada, parts of New England are equal, women are equal, the French are equal, all men, all Homo sapiens are equal. You're saying that that's what they intended.
I I can't say that the majority or all of them had that view, but I do consider that some do, because we know from some of their
Some.
writings.
Oh,
Oh, no, no,
some.
no. Yeah, we do know from some of their writings that that is the case. Okay, and we do know that the argument. Remember, by the time that the Constitution and or even the Declaration of
1 minute.
Independence was in place, okay, I mean England was already going through this whole deliberation, with respect to slavery, right? I mean the empire. I think if I remember correctly, the timeline of everything is that slavery ended in the British Empire as a practice. Not
Sure as
so,
hell
but
didn't end here. It
well,
didn't end
no,
here.
yeah, but that was part of
All
the,
right, man.
you know,
Inside
but
reality. Next time we'll talk about, are all men created equal based on what the founders provided? I say
yeah,
absolutely not.
okay.
You will argue that next time. So Jeffrey Candelier,
And
share
and
the.
also we had a comment. We had a comment. Somebody asked us to talk about reparation. I think we were going
Oh,
to
no, I
have
like
that
that.
conversation, and this would be a perfect part of that conversation as
Yeah,
well.
we'll do that.
For that.
Thank you
So,
for watching, share, and subscribe. Inside Reality. I'm Jeffrey Candelaria.
and Jimmy
Jimmy Cole.
Tran. See you next time.